Hi, and welcome back to the History Hut. I'm Jim, this is Dr. K, and we're going to continue talking about the outcomes of treaty signings.
Yeah, so I was talking about the reserve lands being sold off, and one of the key figures in all of this is a man called Frank Oliver, who's usually known as a kind of booster, you know, a Minister of the Interior for Canada. He was born in Ontario. I mean, what I'm saying is that he gets really good credit. There's Oliver Square in Edmonton and the Oliver Arena, and there's all sorts of Oliver statues all over the place, and he's actually from Ontario, and he apprenticed as a printer at a newspaper, worked for the Globe in Toronto, went out to work for the Winnipeg Free Press, ends up in Edmonton the 1880s, and founds the Edmonton newspaper, the Edmonton Bulletin, and that's where he does a lot of his best work. He also becomes political. He's part of the Northwest Council and then a member of the Northwest Territorial Assembly in the 1880s, and then he's elected to the House of Commons in 1896 and becomes Minister of the Interior in 1905 to 1911. Now, the reason that I mention Frank Oliver is because he spent a lot of his energies in getting native bands around Edmonton removed from their land because he thought that settlers would make better use of it. So he's seen as a great promoter for everything else but his Indian policy. So he's the guy that changed legislation to make it impossible for a reserve to exist within a certain amount of miles of a city or near a city with 8,000 inhabitants. And he's the guy that changed the rules so that you would hand over 50% if you coughed up your land title. He said, well, give it to you in horses and farm equipment. He welcomed new supporters or new settlers petitioning for Indian lands, especially there's one at Villeneuve saying Indians had more land than is of use to them. But you remember that of course they have that land and then they're encouraged to not farm all of it. So it's just it's a nightmare. So one of the things that he said was, now is the time for the government to declare the reserve open and show whether this country is to be run in the interests of settlers or the Indian. So just really, he actually went after the Michelle Band just outside of Edmonton. And they're under a lot of pressure to sell, and the band agreed to sell some of its land, and they held an auction in 1906 and sold about 8,000 acres or so at $9 an acre. 3/4 of the land went to two men who were both political allies of Oliver and liberal politicians, and a year later, neither one of them had paid a cent for the land sale, and the sale should have been cancelled, but it's not actually cancelled until the late 1920s. One of them's cancelled in 1927, the other's cancelled in 1910, and then the cancellation was withdrawn, and the land was sold to an Edmonton bank manager for 1/4 of the original price. And in 1914, the bank manager transferred the title to his father-in-law, Frank Oliver. And Oliver had also got his cleaning lady in the House of Commons to buy lots for him. So the people at the Michelle Band don't see the money from this sale, and this is just the beginning of the nightmare that follows for them. He's also involved, and the government is involved with the sale of the land that the Pappas Chase Band are on, and that's actually Mill Woods in Edmonton. And they had Frank Oliver, through his newspaper, the Edmonton Bulletin, actually advocated the removal of the band and petitioned John A. Macdonald in 1881 to get the band out of there. And he even encouraged new settlers to squat on band land and build little cabins, and just kind of kept petitioning until through the whole series of crazy misadventures, they lose most of their land. Some of these cases are actually court cases that are ongoing at the moment or have just recently been cleared up. Yeah, so there's a problem with the Enoch Band as well, because the Pappas Chase Band are torn apart, and then some of them are sent to Enoch, and some of them are put on a list called the Edmonton Stragglers List, and they take scrip, like the Métis, instead of land. So So there's all this stuff going on as well. So another outcome of the treaty, the feds and the provincial governments agreed in the 1930s after the Statute of Westminster that the provinces had to be consulted in the selection of reserve land, and this has caused huge problems for groups that I'm sure you know of, like the Lubicon Cree in northern Alberta. Their valueless land that they're given originally turns out it's full of oil and it's got lots of timber, and so their land claim that's actually not even looked at until before World War II is not fully settled yet. So, and this is a case for a lot of land claims that the Nisga'a from the 1880s just settled in the late 1990s. So you can expect a huge period of time in between. And it also turned out that the Indian Act overrode this is a bit later on, overrode the 1960 Bill of Rights. And so it was in 1973 that you get the Laval and Bedard case and Lovelace case that saw the government agree that the Bill of Rights and the Charter would apply to all Canadians and override the Indian Act. So there's a problem with that as well, and I can explain that another time. And then schooling, that's one of the issues. Members said that for the Blackfoot Treaty, the salaries of teachers were to be paid to come onto the reserves and teach. Well, of course, that meant that people were promised reserve schools, that your children would be educated where they were. But the government, of course, encouraged another type of schooling that they'd actually been looking at in central Canada and in the States since the 1850s. It's called a number of names: industrial schools, residential schools, or boarding schools, and it's known best in Canada as residential schools. So the government would put up the capital, and then the various churches, mainly the Anglicans and the Catholics, and also some Baptists, they asked the government if they would be allowed to run them, and the government, of course, is quite happy, especially with the Catholics, because they didn't have to pay the priests or the nuns any kind of labor costs. So the schools were used as a way to assimilate the young. If we're not going to be able to change the people on the reserves, maybe we can get the kids. And if we get the kids and we change them, then they'll go back to the reserves and they'll either not want to stay there or they'll change everybody's attitude there. So at the schools, and these have been in the news for the last decade at least, there was to be no speaking of your native language, no spiritual customs allowed, no wearing of traditional clothes. Everybody had their hair cut right away. They were deloused, and there's some amazing pictures of kids, what they looked like when they came into the residential school, and then 6 months later they're in like little sailor suits and they've got wee short haircuts, and the girls are all in wee dresses and stuff. So it changed everything, and so of course the idea was that they would look like other Canadians, and then there were punishments meted out for all sorts of infractions, everything from just kind of humiliation in front of each other to physical punishment like the belt. And of course these days we're more familiar with the sexual intimidation and the sexual harm done to children, and it's recognized now as a terrible disgrace. But at the beginning, when we started to find out what residential schools were really like, it wasn't the sexual part that, even because we didn't know about that, it was just horrifying to find out how poorly the children were fed, how little of an education they actually got, how much how many prayers they had to say during the day. And kids went in at maybe the age of 4 or 5 and came out at 16 or 18, and they would have like a grade 3 education. So we didn't even give them a proper education, and yet they're kept away from their parents all those years. Usually the parents, if they live far away, they couldn't visit, so they wouldn't see their kids for that whole time. The kids would forget their native language. For a lot of kids that came from the north, they couldn't live in the north anymore. It was too cold. They'd been completely, kind of acclimatized to the south. So it's just awful. And of course, not enough doctors, no hospitals. There's all sorts of outbreaks of measles at the turn of the century, and then things like TB as well. And they had no place to put the kids, so they just have all these kids with all these different diseases, all shoved together in like an airless room and kind of cross-contaminating each other. So it's really, really, really bad time. And Shingwalk's Vision by J.R. Miller and The Residential School System by John Malloy are two of the best accounts of the residential school period. And then by the 1950s, they shift that. They're like, oh, we still want everybody to be totally assimilated and be like us, so we'll have school integration. So and they would make the kids, they would let, for the ones that were on reserves, they would let them stay there until I think junior high, and then they would have to go to the local town school, and that involved all sorts of other problems and, kind of overcoming prejudice as well. And so it's just the education issue is just horrendous. So you have, as I said, children that are poorly fed and poorly educated, and now they're sent to these local schools, and the dropout rate rose to 90%. So you're perfectly capable of educating children before that, and then they'd go to local schools and they would drop out very quickly because it's just like a horrible situation. Blue Quills at Saddle Lake fought back in the 1960s when they were told that their reserve school was about to be closed, because there were some reserve schools, and so the residential school that was now a day school, that was to be closed as well. And so in 1969, I think, the elders held a sit-in in the school gymnasium, and they refused to leave, and they were there all summer. And it's just like totally embarrassed the federal government, and Jean Chrétien was the Minister of Indian Affairs at the time. So he visited, and he was persuaded to give them a chance to run their own school. And of course it worked. He didn't think it would work, but it worked, and they're still running their own school system. And this led to a new thing called local control, which is a policy that comes in the 80s. So local control established throughout Canada.
So what about First Nations in the rest of Canada? What were the plans for them?
Okay, well, in the late 1850s, so before Confederation, the United Canadas had passed the Gradual Civilizing Act of 1857, and the idea was to try and interest Indians in the idea of private property and sell them, in effect, lands from their own reserves as individual plots. And this, of course, would destroy the reserve system, because everybody would own individual pieces, private property, etc., etc. So the chiefs rejected this as an attempt to undermine traditional ways and to destroy what little security they felt they had. So the chiefs were now seen as the problem. So it's not just, it's like, got to do something about these guys. So in 1869, 2 years after Confederation, another act was passed called the Enfranchisement Act. That just means the vote, to get the vote, the franchise. So 1869. So its aim was to dismantle Indian self-government and replace it with Canadian political practices. And so it said that, of course, again, the term always used in Indian, Indians should be given land, and that this would allow them to get the vote. So once they were landowners, then they could be given the vote, then they'd be real Canadians, then there'd be no reserves, then there'd be no Indians, and then there'd be no Indian problems. So the question was, again, well, what land are they going to have so that they can get the vote? And of course, again, it's reserve land. So you've got this combination of abolishing the reserve, introducing the concept of private property, and giving men the vote, and then everybody will be Canadians. So, good plan on our side. Yeah. So any Indian of good character who could read or write in French or English and who was free of debts could apply for a plot of land and the vote. Now, it doesn't apply out west, because the native people out west are seen to not be as civilized as one in central Canada, so it doesn't apply there yet. So this is funny, because you couldn't have any debt because nobody would give you any credit because you didn't have any land. So really, it's just about the good character. So in all, something like 21 or so people applied. So not a lot. And only one met the qualifications.
Oh,
so you're going to be hard line when there's only 20. You'd be like, oh, come on in. The chiefs and the missionaries were opposed to this kind of interference, but the lack of appreciation felt on our part for such far-sighted policy moved the government along the road to coercion. If you don't realize this is good for you, then we'll just
make
have to
you
explain
realize
it another way. Yeah. So it decided to turn Indians into wards of the state, and in 1876 passed the Consolidated Indian Act, which kind of brought together all these previous bits of legislation, and it declared, of course, if they're wards of the state, that all Indians are treated as minors. Not the kind that get coal at the coalface, just the miners. So the interesting thing about this is, here you are out in the West. It's between Treaty 6 and Treaty 7, and you're signing with people out there, and you're pretending that you're all equals. And at the same time, down east, you're passing legislation turning everybody into wards of the state and trying to get rid of their land and completely assimilate them. So the Consolidated Indian Act altered the political structure of life. Chiefs were now to be elected. which is what we have, of course, in the modern period, settlements and reserves were to be treated like municipalities. Another idea that's come back to us quite recently. And a chief was elected that didn't suit the Indian agent, because, of course, naturally people would just be, well, we'll just vote for the guy that would have been chief anyway. Then another election was called until a suitable candidate was found. So the Indian agents had to have somebody that they could work with. So, it is kind of coercion. And there's also a Department of Indian Affairs created in about 1880 that would actually, it works as a go-between between the government and different bands. So it works on behalf of the native population, and it took it upon itself under one of its top men, Duncan Campbell Scott, the Confederation poet, D.C. Scott, took it upon itself to try and save the government some money. So that doesn't work well either, because according to the treaties, there were certain obligations. They should have cost a certain amount of money, and then you have these guys cost cutting so that they can bring in a budget that's lower than expected, and that makes them look really good. Not a good idea for the people that are the victims of this. So in some budgets, it just didn't pass on the proper information. And again, Duncan Campbell Scott's a really good example, because he thought that the more intolerable, or the more awful life was in the reserve, the sooner people would leave them for the cities. So, so on the one hand, we've been talking about, you're supposed to get to choose your reserve, hunt freely through your land when you're in Western Canada, and it should have worked out well. And on the other hand, you've got this legislation, and you've got these people running blockers saying, the worse it is, the sooner we'll be rid of this problem. So it's a really schizophrenic attitude towards Native people. And of course, Duncan Campbell Scott believed, as many people did, in this social Darwinist idea that the Indians were disappearing as a people, and the numbers backed him up, because in the 1880s, the overall number was down to about 88,000. So it had been decreasing, but by the 1920s, the number is back up. So he saw reserves as kind of transitional holding pens, the place that people would go to before they would start their real life. So you didn't really have to make them good places. And he thought that Indians were inferior as well, but that eventually their blood would be diluted by marriage. Now, he's famous for a poem called the Onondaga Madonna. And it starts off, this kind of wild native woman, but the child at her breast is a half-breed. And so it's kind of like, you kind of, DNA out of people. You just like intermarry, and soon there won't be any of them left. So it's a really strange thing. The thing that's interesting as well about Duncan Campbell Scott is that he sent his own child to a residential school, but I think in Paris, and she died of smallpox. So the same kind of thing happened to him that was happening to other people in his care. So he actually sought and received quite draconian powers to amend clauses in the Indian Act, not to have to reopen the whole Indian Act, but just kind of add things to it to avoid any resurgence of Indian culture, because they want that to be ended. And it's quite interesting, because you have things like Banff Indian Days that lots of people would go to, or after the Calgary Stampede starts up in the early teens. People go to the Stampede and they see the Indians at the beginning of the parade, and they thought, well, this is bad. We don't want that, because we don't want people looking at them going, oh, how exotic and cool and hip. That's got to be stopped. They have to be like everybody else. So just to sum up the whole discussion, the treaties may have been signed in good faith, but government legislation and a failure to live up to treaty obligations hurt this process, and the interference of Indian affairs after 1880 changes the rules of the game, and it's clearly to get rid of the reserves, assimilate the people. Hopefully some will die off and you won't have to pay out on the obligations, but the best among them will become like us, and eventually, and of course with the help of the residential schools, eventually everybody will be different, and there won't be an Indian problem anymore. So a sad tale, Yeah. And the great thing is that, of course, native culture didn't die off, and native people didn't die out, and there still are, well, of course, we've seen lots of problems in recent years with the conditions on reserves again, but they survived this concerted onslaught against them, and so that's really quite wonderful.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
And I should mention just before we finish that, of course, Native people didn't have the vote either. I'm sure you knew that. You had to, if you wanted to get the vote, you had to, this earlier process, have a piece of land and, be of good character and everything. But It's not until March 31st of 1960 that there's an act to amend the Canada Elections Act and repeal Section 14 that said the following people are disqualified from voting and can't register as voters, and that was every Indian as defined in the Indian Act or normally living on reserves unless they had served in World War I or World War II or were on active duty with Canadian forces before 1950. So before that, you had to actually give up your Indian status. You had to say, I'm not an Indian anymore. Take me off the big Indian roll in the sky. I'm a Canadian if you wanted to vote. And also, if you wanted to go to university, you couldn't be...
Really?
Yeah, you couldn't be an Indian and go to university. So a lot of these changes come in the very modern period.
Well, I think that about wraps up our discussion on treaties. We'll be back next time with some more History Hut.
Yeah, bye.